About 12 years ago, I was in my mid-20s and completely convinced that I was going to make it as a touring guitarist. I had been playing since I was 9 years old, and music was the only thing I was ever genuinely good at. I skipped college entirely, worked nights at a gas station to fund my gas tank and guitar strings, and spent every spare hour driving to whatever venue would have me. Spoiler, I never made it. I ended up managing a hardware store in the same town where I grew up, which honestly might be funnier than any punchline I ever could have written. But none of that is the real story here. The real story is about the worst night of my life, which also happened to be the night I came closest to it being my last. For context, the independent music circuit is brutal in a way that most people don't understand unless they've lived it. You're not playing arenas. You're playing bars with sticky floors and broken PUI systems, splitting a $50 door cut with 3 other bands, and driving home at 2 in the morning on 4 hours of sleep. The grind is relentless, and the payoff is almost always nothing but the love of the thing, which for a while was enough for me. I'd been grinding the regional circuit for about 4 years when a promoter reached out about a showcase being held in a mid-sized city about 6 hours from where I lived in rural Tennessee. The show was being put together by a small independent label that was actively looking to sign new acts. Real scouts, real interest, real money on the table. First place got studio time worth several $1,000s and a 6-month development contract. For someone like me, drowning in obscurity with a rusted-out Chevy Blazer and a cell phone I bought prepaid from a drugstore, this felt like the kind of opportunity that only comes once. I loaded my gear the night before, printed out the directions, and left before sunrise. The drive started the way all long drives do, uneventful and almost meditative. I had a burned CD of my own demos playing on loop, rehearsing mentally, visualizing the set. Tennessee farmland rolled past me for hours, flat and wide and brown in the early October light. I had driven enough of these roads to stop noticing them. Somewhere past the 4-hour mark, I made a wrong turn. I didn't realize it at first. The road looked like every other road. 2 lanes, cracked asphalt, dense tree lines on both sides pressing in close. It took another 20 minutes before I accepted that I hadn't seen a highway marker in a very long time. My phone had almost no signal. The printed directions were useless because I no longer knew where I was on them. I kept driving, hoping the road would eventually connect to something familiar, the way roads usually do. Instead, it narrowed. That's the detail I keep coming back to. The road physically narrowed, like it was being slowly swallowed by the woods on either side. The tree branches started meeting overhead, filtering out the afternoon sunlight and turning everything dim and greenish. I passed a hand-painted sign nailed to a post that was too faded to read. Then another. I slowed down to look at the second one and made out the word "private" before I kept moving. Eventually, I came to a property. Calling it a town would be too generous. It was a cluster of maybe 5 or 6 structures arranged loosely around a clearing. A long, low building that might have once been a general store, a couple of trailers, a rusted equipment shed with its doors hanging open. There were vehicles scattered around, old trucks mostly, some on blocks. A dog chained to a post watched me pull in without making a sound. I noticed there was a hand pump well near the center of the clearing, which struck me as deeply unusual. No power lines ran to this place as far as I could tell. I needed to turn around. That was my only goal. As I was executing a 3-point turn in the clearing, a man stepped out of the long building and stood watching me. He was heavyset, wearing a canvas jacket, completely still. I gave a wave through the windshield the way you do when you're trying to communicate that you mean no harm. He didn't wave back. He just watched. Before I finished turning, 2 more people had come out and were standing beside him. None of them spoke to each other. They just watched me leave. I got back on the narrow road and pushed the Blazer as fast as I reasonably could. I told myself I was being paranoid. Remote people are suspicious of strangers. That's not unusual. That's human nature. I focused on finding a way back to a real road. I found one about 15 minutes later, a proper 2-lane state road with reflective markers and a speed limit sign. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. My phone picked up a single bar of service, and I managed to pull up a rough idea of where I was. I was significantly off course, but not unrecoverably so. If I pushed hard, I might still make the show with 30 minutes to spare. I was doing fine for another half hour before I noticed the truck. It was behind me, far enough back that I couldn't make out the details, but close enough to be consistent. Every time I slowed, it slowed. Every time I accelerated, it kept pace. I told myself it was just someone else on the same road going the same direction. That happens. Roads are shared things. I changed my speed several times trying to create distance, and the truck matched me each time without ever closing the gap, which was somehow worse than if it had sped up aggressively. Then it turned off. Gone. I watched the headlights disappear onto a side road, and I laughed at myself out loud in the car, completely alone and already spooked by my own imagination. 10 minutes later, the Blazer started pulling hard to the right. I knew the feeling immediately. I'd had blowouts before. I eased onto the shoulder and climbed out to look. It wasn't a blowout. The rear passenger tire was almost completely flat, deflating slowly but decisively. When I crouched down to look at it, I found a screw embedded in the tread. Just one, which made me think road debris, pure bad luck, nothing more. I opened the back hatch to get the spare. The spare was flat. I had known this for approximately 3 months and kept meaning to get it addressed, and never did. So I stood on the shoulder of a state road in rural Tennessee as the last of the daylight disappeared. With no working spare, 1 bar of cell service that dropped every time I tried to make a call, and somewhere behind me, a cluster of buildings full of people who had watched me leave with expressions I couldn't read. I kept trying my phone. I got through to a tow service briefly, but lost the call before I could finish giving my location. I tried my friend Marcus, who knew I was making this drive, but it went to voicemail. I left a message telling him where I thought I was and what had happened. I got back in the car, locked the doors, and waited. About 20 minutes passed before I saw headlights. They came from behind me, slowing as they approached. I was watching in the rearview mirror, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle as it came into range of my taillights. It was a truck. Old, dark-colored, riding high on its frame. It stopped about 40 yards back, engine running, lights on. Just stopped. Didn't pull up behind me the way someone stopping to help would. Didn't pull around me to pass. Just sat there, engine idling. I watched it for what I estimate was about 3 minutes before the driver's door opened. A figure got out and stood beside the truck without moving toward me. Then the passenger door opened. Another figure. They stood there in the road, 2 silhouettes backlit by their own headlights, saying nothing, doing nothing that I could see. That's when I recognized the shape of the truck. It was the same truck I had seen leaving the property. The low building, the silent people, the dog that hadn't barked. I cannot tell you with absolute certainty that it was the exact same truck because it was dark, and my mind was doing things that frightened minds do. But the profile was identical. Same high stance, same boxy cab, same way it sat heavy on its rear axle. One of the figures started walking toward me, not running, walking. Slowly and deliberately, the way someone walks when they're not worried about anything. I put the Blazer in drive. The front right tire was losing pressure, but I still had 3 functioning tires, and forward momentum was better than whatever was about to happen if I stayed. I pulled onto the road and drove on the flat for as long as I had to, watching the headlights of the truck in my mirror as it did not follow me. I drove maybe 1.5 miles before the front rim started grinding into the road, and I had to stop again. I grabbed my phone and my backpack and got out and walked. I walked for close to 45 minutes down the center of that road, with my phone's flashlight app cutting a narrow white beam ahead of me, listening to the woods on both sides, before I reached an intersection with a gas station that was closed but had an exterior light running. I sat under that light and waited. A state trooper found me about an hour later, responding to a call from Marcus, who had gotten my voicemail, and pieced together roughly where I was. I told the trooper everything. He was professional and patient. He told me the area had a history of problems he couldn't elaborate on, and that I had made the right call by getting out of the vehicle. He said that specific road I had turned off of had been flagged before. He didn't say flagged for what. I didn't push it. I never made the showcase. I never got another opportunity quite like it. I drove a rental car home 2 days later, after a tow and a tire replacement that cost me most of my savings. I quit the circuit about a year after that, gradually and without a dramatic decision, the way most people quit the things they love. But sometimes at night, I think about that figure walking toward my car. Slow and patient, not running because it didn't need to run. And I think about what would have happened if my phone had been completely dead, if Marcus hadn't checked his voicemail, if I had waited just a few minutes longer before I drove away. I don't have an ending that explains anything. I just have the memory of that walk and the sound of my own footsteps and the certainty that something behind me in the dark was not trying to help. Be careful on roads you don't know. And always, always fix your spare tire. I have spent the better part of the last 8 months trying to convince myself that what happened to my sister and me last October was something I can eventually put behind me. I haven't managed it yet. I don't know if I ever will. Some context about who I am before I get into it. I'm a planner, not in the casual sense. I'm the person who prepares for a disaster that hasn't even been predicted yet, just to feel like I'm in the driver's seat. My therapist used to call it a coping mechanism. My sister called it exhausting. I called it responsible. After everything that happened, I'm not sure what to call it anymore, because all my planning didn't protect a single thing. My sister Renee is 3 years younger than me, and the polar opposite of who I am. She's impulsive, loud, and magnetic in that way, where you can't be annoyed at her for very long, because she's already made you laugh about it. When our mother passed away in the spring, suddenly, a stroke. No warning. Renee was the one who kept calling me, checking in, sending me stupid memes at 2 in the morning, just to make sure I was still functioning. After about 5 months of grief that I honestly don't remember very clearly, she proposed the trip. Not a question, really. More of a decree. She said we needed to get out of our respective apartments and go somewhere our mother had always talked about going. The Pacific Northwest. Mountains, fog, trees so tall you have to lean your whole body back to see the tops. I agreed before I'd even thought it through. That alone should have told me something was off in my head. We flew into Portland and rented a car. The plan, the one I actually did put together, had us driving up into Washington State along the coast, hitting a few small towns, and staying in a cabin I'd booked through a rental site on the 2nd and 3rd nights. The first night was supposed to be a proper hotel. Renee, predictably, had other ideas by the time we were 40 minutes outside Portland. She'd seen a listing on some obscure travel forum she'd been lurking on for weeks. A lakefront property, private, remote, only accessible by fire road. The owner apparently rented it for a fraction of what comparable places cost, because it wasn't on any mainstream platform. Cash only, confirmed via email, key under the mat. She'd already paid the deposit. I want to be clear that I absolutely was not okay with this arrangement. I expressed that at length. But Renee had a way of framing things that made me feel like my caution was actually grief avoidance, like I was using logistics to hide from the fact that I didn't really know how to just be somewhere quiet with my own thoughts. She wasn't entirely wrong, and I missed my mother. And the photos of the lake in the listing were genuinely beautiful. So I let her navigate us off the main highway and onto a logging road that the GPS stopped recognizing about 3 miles in. The property was real, at least. That was my first relief. The cabin existed. The key was where it was supposed to be, and the lake was even more beautiful in person than in the photos. Still, black, ringed with Douglas firs that turned the whole shoreline into a wall of shadow by mid-afternoon. The inside of the cabin was clean and simply furnished. Nothing alarming. Nothing off. I remember standing on the back porch with a glass of wine while Renee skipped stones into the lake and thinking that maybe this was actually exactly what we needed. That thought has haunted me ever since. We cooked dinner, talked about our mother for the first time, without either of us falling apart, and went to bed early. I'm a deep sleeper, which is unusual. Renee always claims she can't sleep anywhere that isn't her own bed. So I was surprised when I woke up at some point in the deep middle of the night and found the other side of the bed empty. I wasn't immediately alarmed. I assumed she'd gotten up for water or stepped out onto the porch. I lay there for a few minutes waiting for the sound of her coming back. It didn't come. I got up. She wasn't in the kitchen. She wasn't in the bathroom. The back porch was empty. The front porch was empty. Both doors were unlocked, which could have meant anything. I stood in the center of the cabin in the dark and felt the specific kind of quiet that I can only describe as the absence of something that should be there. I called her name. No answer. I called her phone. I heard it buzzing from the counter. She'd left it behind. I told myself she was just outside, probably sitting at the water's edge the way she did sometimes when she couldn't sleep. I stepped off the front porch and walked around the side of the cabin toward the lake. The moon was high and bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight. The shoreline was empty. The water was perfectly still. And that's when I noticed the boat. There was a small aluminum rowboat tied to the short dock that extended maybe 15 feet into the lake. I had not noticed this boat during the day. I was nearly certain it had not been there at sunset. It was now tied to the end of the dock with a length of orange rope, and it was empty, and it was wet in a way that suggested it had recently been used. I stood on the dock for a long time. I told myself there were explanations. The owner might use the dock. A neighbor might have tied up. Renee might have gone for a row and come back and gone inside through a door I missed. Except I would have heard the door, and her phone was still on the counter. I went back inside and checked every room again, more carefully this time, opening closets, looking under beds, doing things that felt paranoid and also felt completely insufficient. Then I noticed something I had not seen on my first pass through the cabin. On the small dining table, there was a piece of paper that had not been there at dinner. I recognized it as a page torn from the notepad that had been sitting next to the landline phone. One of those decorative cabin touches, a rotary-style phone that I'd assumed was prop. The page had a single sentence on it, handwritten in letters too neat to be frantic, too deliberate to be casual. It said, "She went to see it. Don't go after her. I would like to tell you that I handled the next several minutes with some measure of composure. I did not." I sat down on the kitchen floor, and I think I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I picked up the landline and discovered it had a dial tone, and I called 911 and stayed on with the dispatcher for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 15 minutes, until I heard the sound of tires on the fire road. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. They were thorough and kind, and did not make me feel like I was overreacting. They swept the property. They confirmed Renee was not on the premises. They called in the boat. They began a search of the lake's perimeter. They found Renee at 4:40 in the morning, about a quarter mile down the shoreline, sitting on a boulder at the water's edge, with her knees pulled up to her chest and her eyes open. She was physically unharmed. She was not responsive in the way that a person is normally unresponsive. She wasn't unconscious. She wasn't injured. She was looking at something none of us could see, out across the water, and she did not seem to register that we were there until one of the deputies crouched in front of her and put a hand on her shoulder. What she said when she finally came back to herself, and I have replayed this more times than I can count, was that she didn't remember leaving the cabin. She said the last thing she remembered was waking up because she heard something moving in the water outside the window, a sound she described as rhythmic, like something large shifting its weight repeatedly just beneath the surface. She said she had stood up to look and seen something out on the lake in the dark, and after that, her memory went completely white until she was sitting on the boulder with the deputy's flashlights in her face. She had no memory of the boat. She had no memory of the note. She didn't know who could have written it. The deputies found no one else on the property. The note was real. They bagged it. The boat's orange rope was tied with a knot that the senior deputy, a man who'd grown up fishing that area, said he didn't recognize. He said it wasn't a hitch he'd seen before. He said it took him a few minutes just to work it loose. He didn't elaborate on why that bothered him, but I could see that it did. The rental listing was taken down before I'd even finished filing the incident report. The email address Renee had used to book the stay bounced back when the deputies tried to contact the listed owner. The cash she'd sent was gone. Renee is fine, technically. She's back in her apartment. She's back at work. She doesn't talk about it. And the one time I pushed, she said the thing she found most disturbing wasn't the gap in her memory, wasn't waking up on a boulder in the cold with no shoes on. She'd been wearing shoes when she'd gone to bed, and they were never recovered. And wasn't even the knowledge that someone had been inside the cabin while we were sleeping. What disturbed her most was the note. Specifically the fact that whoever wrote it had assumed I would be awake to read it. That they had known I would wake up and look for her and find the table and find the note. That the note wasn't a warning so much as an instruction, a management of my behavior. Whoever wrote it didn't want me following her. And what I keep coming back to, in my own private version of this, is that I didn't follow her. I called the police instead of going down to the water. I stayed inside. I did exactly what the note told me to do. I have no idea what I would have seen if I'd gone after her. I don't know if that makes me lucky, or if it makes me something else entirely. The shoes have never been found. I never thought a honeymoon road trip would be the thing that broke me. Not the marriage itself, not the years of long distance, not any of the 1,000 smaller difficulties that come with loving someone the way I loved her. It was supposed to be the reward for all of it. 2 weeks, just us, winding through the American Southwest in my old Chevy Silverado, with a foam mattress thrown in the back and nothing but open highway ahead. She had always been the one who romanticized the idea of sleeping under the stars. I was more of a hotel person, honestly. But she looked at me with those eyes and described the way the Milky Way looked from the Utah desert, like she had already been there in a dream, and I couldn't say no. I never could. So we planned the route ourselves, printed the maps old school because she thought it was charming, bought 2 good sleeping bags, and left on a Tuesday morning before the sun had even thought about coming up. The first week was everything she promised it would be. We drove through Nevada, crossed into Arizona, looped up into Utah, where the red rock formations looked like something a god had built out of anger and then forgotten about. Every night we found a designated dispersed camping area, rolled out the mattress, and lay on our backs watching the skidoo things that the city never let it do. I had never felt more at peace in my life. What I didn't notice, at least not consciously, was that certain things were slightly off from the very first night. Small things, easy to dismiss individually. A tire pressure reading that was lower than it should have been, even though we hadn't driven rough terrain. A half-eaten protein bar on the floor of the back seat that neither of us remembered opening. My phone moved from where I had set it on the dash to the center console cup holder. My wife mentioned once that she thought she could smell cigarette smoke in the cab, faint and stale, and since neither of us smoked, I told her it was probably just embedded in the upholstery from a previous owner. She accepted that. She was good at accepting reasonable explanations. Around the 9th day, she started sleeping poorly. Not the dramatic sleeplessness of fear or anxiety, just the shallow, restless kind, where you drift in and out and wake up feeling more tired than you did at midnight. She told me her dreams had been strange, crowded. She said she kept dreaming that there were people standing outside the truck watching us sleep, dozens of them in absolute silence, just watching. I told her it was the unfamiliar terrain, the altitude changes, the lack of routine. I believe I actually used the word cortisol at some point, which she found ridiculous enough to laugh at, and that was the end of that conversation. What she never told me, and what I only found out much later, was that on the 9th night, she had woken up at around 3 in the morning and seen something through the rear window of the truck cab. She thought she saw the shape of a head, just the crown and the very top of a face, low and pressed against the outside of the rear window glass. She stared at it for what she estimated was several seconds before it slowly dropped below the window line. She convinced herself she had imagined it. She didn't tell me because she said she didn't want to ruin the trip. I have spent an enormous amount of time since then sitting with that single decision. On the 11th night, We were parked in a canyon area in southern Utah, the kind of place where the walls of rock close in on both sides and the sky above you becomes a narrow corridor of stars. It was genuinely one of the most beautiful places I had ever been. The silence there was a different kind of silence than the open desert. It had texture to it. It pressed against your eardrums in a way that made you feel like the canyon was breathing around you. I woke up at approximately 2 in the morning, and I did not know why. There was no sound, no movement, nothing that should have pulled me out of sleep. But something did. I lay still for a moment and stared up at the strip of sky above the canyon walls. Then, very slowly, I became aware of the fact that the mattress had a very faint but consistent vibration to it. Not movement, vibration. The kind of thing you feel rather than see or hear. The truck was moving. Barely. But it was moving. We were on flat ground. There was no wind. The engine was off. I sat up slowly, keeping my breathing even, and I looked over the side of the truck bed. The ground outside was pale gray in the moonlight, and I could see our camping setup, the 2 camp chairs, the small cooler, the collapsed fire ring we had never used. Everything looked exactly as we had left it. Then I looked toward the back of the truck. The tailgate was closed, but in the narrow gap between the tailgate and the bed, something had shifted. I kept a storage bin back there, a large plastic one with a latching lid where we kept extra supplies, rain gear, tools, a first aid kit. The lid was slightly open, not fully, just slightly, the way it might look if someone had opened it carefully and not pressed it all the way back down. I told myself the latch was faulty. I had noticed it sticking before. I lay back down and stared at the sky and waited to feel tired again. But sleep didn't come, and the vibration in the mattress didn't entirely stop. In the morning, I went through the storage bin while she was brushing her teeth at the portable wash station we had set up. I told myself I was just reorganizing. What I actually found was that things inside the bin were not in the order I had packed them. The rain gear had been moved from one side to the other. A flashlight I kept toward the back was now at the front. The first aid kit, which I always stored with its latch facing up, was facing down. None of these things were impossible to explain, but taken together, they were enough to make me stand there in the morning sunlight, holding a rain jacket I didn't need, and feel the first real crawl of something I didn't have a word for yet. I didn't tell my wife. That night, the 12th, I decided to stay awake. I was not panicking. I was not convinced something was wrong. I was simply deciding to stay awake. I helped her get settled in the sleeping bag, and I sat with my back against the cab window, knees up, and watched the perimeter of our camp. We were in a more open location that night, a flat stretch of dispersed camping land in the Colorado high desert, and I could see for a good distance in every direction in the moonlight. Nothing moved for the first 2 hours. At around 1 in the morning, I heard the sound. It was not dramatic. It was not a branch snapping or a scream or anything from a horror film. It was the sound of careful footsteps in dry dirt. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The kind of footsteps made by something that does not want to be heard, but is too heavy to be entirely silent. I turned my head toward the sound without moving my body. On the far driver's side of the truck, at the edge of where the moonlight reached, I could see a shape crouched low to the ground, moving slowly along the side of the vehicle. My brain sorted through options in rapid sequence. Animal. Coyote too large. Deer would not move that way. Bear would make more sound. Mountain lion was possible, but the silhouette was wrong. The silhouette was wrong because it was a person. I watched the shape reach the front tire and stop. For a full minute, nothing happened. The crouched figure simply stayed at the front tire, still, with a hand resting on the wheel. Well, I could not see a face. I could not see much detail at all, but the shape was unmistakably human. I made the decision not to wake my wife, not yet. What I did instead was reach slowly into my jacket pocket and wrap my hand around my phone. I opened the camera with every setting on silent and I held it over the edge of the truck bed and took a photograph in the direction of the figure. The shape was gone by the time I looked with my own eyes again. I sat completely still for the next 3 hours until the sky started to go pale. Nothing else happened. When my wife woke up, I told her I hadn't slept well, and I suggested we get moving earlier than usual. She didn't question it. I looked at the photograph from the previous night, while she drove the first stretch of the morning. The image was dark and grainy from the low light conditions. But there, at the edge of the frame, crouched next to the front tire, was a figure in dark clothing with something pressed against the side of the wheel well. I zoomed in until the image broke apart into pixels. What I thought I could see in the figure's hand, though I cannot say this with certainty, was a rectangular shape. A phone. The figure was pressed against my front tire in the middle of the night in the Colorado desert, appearing to photograph the underside of my vehicle. I said nothing to my wife. I began going over the trip in my mind from the beginning, trying to find a pattern. I thought about the tire pressure. I thought about the protein bar. I thought about my phone moved to the cup holder, about the storage bin lid, about the shifted flashlight, about the face my wife had seen in the rear window and had not told me about until days later. Someone had been with us, not following us, with us. We stopped for gas in a small town outside Moab, and while she went inside to get coffee, I walked around the entire truck very slowly and looked at everything. I checked the exterior. I checked the undercarriage as best I could, without getting on my back in a gas station parking lot. And then I looked inside the storage bin in the truck bed again, because I couldn't stop thinking about it. At the very bottom of the bin, beneath the first aid kit, beneath the rain gear, pressed flat against the bottom of the container, I found a folded piece of paper. It was a printed MapQuest route. Our route. All of it, from the first night to the last, with each stopping point marked. The paper was soft from handling, slightly grimy at the edges. Someone had been looking at this for 11 days. But what turned my blood cold, what made me stand there in that gas station parking lot unable to move for nearly a full minute, was what was written in the margin at the top of the page in small, neat handwriting. It said, "She doesn't deserve you." The handwriting was not my wife's, and it was not mine. And below that, in slightly larger letters, "Last night." I called the police right there in the parking lot. I told my wife everything. She sat very quietly in the passenger seat listening to me, and when I finished, she asked me only one question, which was whether we should keep driving or stay put and wait for the officers. We stayed put. The investigating officers who came out of the Moab area did a full search of the truck, inside a small magnetic case attached to the inner frame of the rear wheel. Well, they found a GPS tracking device, commercial grade, the kind you could order online. It had been there long enough that there was dust settled into its casing that matched the dust on the surrounding frame. Someone had placed it there before the trip began. They knew every place we stopped before we stopped there. They had been there, waiting, for 11 nights. The case is still technically open. There have been no arrests. There is no confirmed identity. The tracking device was wiped and yielded no prints. The note was the same. My truck's exterior cameras, which I had installed precisely because I'm paranoid about parking lot dings, had been disabled from the exterior on the first night. Something I had not noticed because I had never needed to check the footage before. The investigators told me, as carefully as they could, that whoever this was had planned it extensively and in advance. They knew my vehicle. They knew our route. They had access to my truck before we left. They were patient. They were careful. And they were watching from somewhere close enough that they could hear everything we said at night and choose to do nothing. For 11 nights, they chose to do nothing. That is what I think about. Not the knife I feared, not the tracker they found, not even the note. I think about the choice. 11 nights of watching and waiting and doing nothing and still leaving that paper for me to find. As a message, as a proof of presence, as a way of saying, without ever showing a face, I was here. I was always here. and I will be when I choose to be. My wife and I drove home in 14 hours without stopping except for gas. We haven't been back to the desert. She says she will go back someday, that she refuses to let someone take that from her. I don't disagree with her out loud, but I sleep with the bedroom door locked now, every night, without exception. And every time I walk to my truck in the driveway, I stand there for a moment before getting in, looking at it, trying to remember if anything looks different from how I left it. So far, nothing has.